Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out on a Saturday to hear a wonderful presentation from our colleague, Eliana Stanislawski. Eliana has been working at HIAS for the past year and a half in community ESL, and they have developed some absolutely wonderful programming, and they're going to tell you about it today. So Eliana, the floor is yours.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much. And welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming out on a Saturday morning. I really appreciate you taking the time and wanting to learn more about the experience I had. Let me get my screen up for you. My presentation today is all about rapid program development and particularly my experience building an English for Employment course in 2 months. But before we start that, I want to ask you guys a question. Can anybody read the scenario that I've written out here? I'm a teacher, so you have to participate when you're in my session. Wow, not everybody all at once.
I can, Eliana.
Thank you, Michelle. Oh, thank you.
You're welcome. It is August 1st. You have been informed that there has been a shift at your nonprofit, and now you will no longer be teaching in your prior program. Now you will need to teach and design an English for Employment intensive English program for 4 days a week. It will start on October 1st. You still have to teach your current courses for 3 more weeks. What steps will you take to establish this program in the next 2 months?
Thank you so much, Michelle. So I know that we have a small group here. So rather than go into a breakout room, Bill suggested that maybe we just have a group discussion. I think that that's a great idea. So I am going to zip my lips. I'm curious about what you all would do in this situation.
Step one, I think I'd cry. That's a tall order.
Okay, so cry. I won't reveal whether or not I did that.
I think try to get data, like what level of students you're expecting, how many you're expecting. Is it in person or online? What are the objectives?
I would reach out to my colleagues and also anybody that I had like professional networking with to see if they had any recommendations or tips or any experience with a program like this.
I think I'd also try to find out what kind of employment it is that they're doing, because different workplaces are going to require different language, or at least different vocabulary.
I think I would also prioritize, reusing old lesson plans and things like that, things that have already worked well in your existing 3 weeks, and try to finish strong, but also be a little bit more on autopilots, knowing that you're one person trying to do a lot of things.
So that's in regards to the classes that you're actively teaching, right?
I would also look at material, see if there's any art created material already, whether in your program or just in general, that you could use so that you don't have to start from scratch.
I think also thinking about it, I think when you think about there's a difference between program and then the actual curriculum and the lessons that are being delivered, right? So I think thinking about them a little bit differently in that program wise, what are the administrative tasks and steps you need to take to set that up? And then thinking about it curriculum wise, I think, we all know that sometimes when we plan something out from start to finish, like an entire curriculum or half a semester or terms worth of curriculum, we end up changing so much after the first couple of classes because we learn about the students and we learn what works and what doesn't. So I think maybe thinking about that, in terms of, okay, how do I want to start, my first couple of weeks of classes or my first, 2 weeks of classes? What do I want to try out and see what works? And then how can I build that out and think about it administratively a little bit differently, where you kind of do have to build that out a little bit more. So without knowing how much program administration is involved here, I would think about those two things a little bit separately.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Val. And also kind of hits home on one of the weaknesses I had, like when I was building my program, is I focused a lot on the curriculum side because that's where my experience is. And I mean, I have program administration experience, but this was different. And so also, clearly I didn't have so much time, but I think that's really well taken on my end because I definitely needed to strengthen my muscles in that area. These are all great points. Does anybody have anything else that you would do to prep in this, like month and a half to 2 month timeline?
I suppose I'd try to find out what language level the students already have.
Mm-hmm.
Are we talking about people with interrupted education? Are we talking about people who already have degrees in their home country and are coming here to work? I mean, based on what you put here, we have no idea.
That's a good point.
I'm also trying to,
go ahead, Val. Michelle.
No, Michelle, you should go first.
Well, I was going to say, I know about the behind the scenes of this, but the other thing I would think about is, if there are grant requirements that you need to meet and what the expectations are, so that you're not, putting all of your energy into one area and then it actually needs to shift much later.
That's a good point. Yeah, Val.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. And then to kind of relate to that, but just in general, because it is, this is a good thing to do, and no matter, what kind of timeline you have, and but setting setting up a timeline of goals and deadlines, things that you can aim to meet, giving yourself some grace if you're not meeting them, but just laying that out. Okay, I'm going to focus on this, try to get this done by this point, and the next step and the next step, just to help it be a little bit, little less overwhelming.
I will say, Michelle, help me do that. Make a timeline of goals and when am I gonna get certain things done by certain dates? Because kind of like what Bill said, I was mostly in an emotional place. So yeah, that's also well taken, and I want to shout out Michelle for how she helped me with that. Anything else you would do? Anything else you would think about? All of those are really great points. And oh wait, Bill, were you going to say something else?
No, I was talking to myself.
Oh,
I'm trying.
I love that, and I celebrate that. Self-talk is so important. All of those were excellent points. All of those were definitely components that had to go into my planning. Some of the things the information I was able to access, some of which I wasn't. I'm going to talk about all of that in a second, but thank you so much for contributing. I think it's nice to open up with an opportunity to hear what you would do, because also it helps me going forward. And it shows that, we're all in the same place. We're all encountering different challenges together, and we're all just doing our best. So it's nice to meet you. My name is Eliana. I have been working in adult ESL for about 6 years, and I've been working with refugee communities for almost 9 years now. I've been very lucky to work at Highest Pennsylvania in their adult education program for the past 1.5 years, amongst an incredible team of educators and community workers, some of whom are here today. And as I said earlier, the situation that you just reviewed is what I experienced this summer. After a year of developing and running English for Daily Living classes with my colleagues that were available to all our reception and placement refugee clients, I had to rapidly change my role and develop an English for Employment language intensive that focused on our employment clients and their needs. This shift was a big challenge. And looking back on it from the vantage of December is gratifying and also a little bit exhausting, but I'm very happy to be here talking about it because I'm proud of what I've done. And I think we can all learn from each other through experiences like this. Through the course of this presentation, I'm going to walk you through the process that I engaged with to build this program with such a quick turnaround, where I feel I succeeded, where I feel I struggled, and how I'm hoping to move forward with it. Here's just a brief overview of the different things I'm going to be talking about today. We're going to talk about needs assessment, curriculum development, lesson planning, methodology assessment, cultural competency, changes moving forward. I'll briefly conclude, and then we'll have another discussion, and maybe we'll just kind of combine our discussion and Q&A since we've got a small group today. But thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. I don't take it for granted at all. And I hope that this is useful and interesting for you. Okay, let's get going here. So before we discuss the various ways in which I went through the program design process, I wanted to give you an overview of how I structured my approach. This particular chart is a model of the parts of the curriculum design process that was developed by Nation and McAllister in their book, Language Curriculum Design. In the outer circles, the theoretical and practical considerations are represented, and they serve as a guide for the curriculum design process. So these are the factors that I first evaluated when designing my course via the sub-processes of environmental analysis, needs analysis, and principal selection before moving towards those ideas represented in the inner circles, which are the components that make up the actual curriculum. I relied heavily on this procedural framing as I moved through this process, feeling that I needed a supportive structure while operating on such a short design timeline. And like I said, I'm going to focus heavily on my curriculum design today. We'll talk a little bit about programmatic stuff later on, but if you have questions about that and feel like you want to know more about it, please ask, because there's certainly a lot going into that as well. So in order to assess needs, first, you have to understand the context. I have some people here who I know can answer this question, so maybe you guys can sit back, or you can help each other out here. Who knows what makes somebody a refugee, and what is the difference between an immigrant and a refugee?
I'll give it a try, since
yeah,
I don't
Bill, go ahead.
work
Let's
in
keep
that
Michelle and Val
community.
quiet.
So I'm kind of guessing on this. So
Okay.
I know that a refugee is leaving their country due to some hardship within their country or danger within their country.
Mm-hmm.
And that is different from an immigrant population who comes here without necessarily such a situation. And
Mm-hmm.
a refugee has to be here first and then get refugee status. That's what I think I know.
Some of that was very spot on. Some of that I'll adjust a little bit. Does anybody have any other contributions before I hop in with my own definition of what makes someone a refugee? So the way that Bill defined the circumstances of being a refugee was pretty accurate. So according to the 1951 UN Convention on Refugees, a refugee is any person who is outside their home country and is unable and unwilling to return to that country because of persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. And they are unable or unwilling to avail themselves of the protection of that country or return there for fear of persecution. So an important distinction is that you cannot come legally to this country as a refugee. You have to be granted that status abroad, and then you are given the opportunity to come here. What you were referencing is seeking asylum. So there are asylum laws where, for example, at the southern border, if you cross the border and then you claim asylum, you are legally entitled to go through the asylum process. And we can get into this if you want, but there are interesting exceptions happening now with lots of people like Afghans and Ukrainians being granted special parolee status where they're not legally refugees, but some of them are now having the opportunity to claim asylum here because they did not go through the year-plus long process of applying for refugee status abroad. They were brought here rapidly under special circumstances. Does that clarify? Yeah. Okay. So right now, as of 2023, there are 108.4 million people who are forcibly displaced. And that includes 35.3 million refugees, 62.5 million internally displaced people. So that means you are within the borders of your own country, but you have been displaced by these circumstances. And 5.4 million asylum seekers who are going through the asylum claim process, either in this country or abroad. looking at Highest Pennsylvania, we are government funded to serve refugees primarily for the first 90 days after they have arrived in the US. So that starts from picking them up at the airport and 90 days onward from there. Some of our clients are eligible to receive supportive services for longer periods if they enroll in certain programs, which includes our employment programs. Newcomer refugees present a whole host of learning needs that separate them from the typical adult ESL students. And those needs are a whole presentation onto themselves, and those exist online if you'd like to learn more. But in short, they are typically in need of a lot of flexibility that can accommodate a high number of absences because they have many appointments during the first few months of living in the US. They are in need of highly sensitive instructors who have an understanding of the trauma of resettlement and content that directly connects to their unique circumstances and needs as recently resettled refugees. Working at a resettlement agency is also a very different professional environment than an adult education center or university. When we get into the weeds and the program development aspects of things, documentation of learning is much more tied to case management than it is tied to the sort of metrics you would encounter at a traditional learning center. For example, working under this new grant, when my funding source shift, that was the first time, to my knowledge, I can get corrected here if necessary. That's the first time to my knowledge that any of our adult education programs were using standardized language testing. I know that our citizenship programs use them, but within our own classes, we were not employing those types of metrics and assessments. And I'll talk about that more later. But instead of that, we were always focused on other documentation requirements. And then the stipulations of this grant increased those documentation requirements. So for example, I'm required to provide multiple types of case notes for every student for every day that they attend my course. And in addition to that, we have post-documentation arrival of English language assessment that goes into a government database that deals with the resettlement process as a whole. And on top of that, we have to coordinate with resettlement case managers frequently to make sure we're providing appropriate wraparound support for learners as they navigate their new lives in the United States. So this can present unique challenges when it comes to time management and focusing on your teaching, because you're not just a normal teacher when you work at a place like Highest Pennsylvania. You're also a nonprofit coordinator operating under the auspices of a complex government program, working in coordination with social workers and community providers in order to, support refugees going through a really complex process. So given all of this, given the timeline, given my responsibilities, given that I was still teaching, I did not really have a lot of time to gather data and conduct an in-depth needs assessment with my learners to create a curriculum in advance. So I charted my way through this stage of development within the span of a couple of weeks. I began on my own by just writing an environmental analysis where I identified that the most relevant constraints on my curriculum were related to grant requirements, as we discussed, the learning environment, which we also discussed. Are we learning online? Are we learning in person? How often are we doing that? And the newcomer refugees' particular learning needs. After that, I shared a needs analysis questionnaire with the staff of Highest Pennsylvania's employment team, who I would now be working really closely with as I develop this program. Via ranked choice voting and open-ended questions, I was able to determine which content to prioritize in my curriculum and which language targets were recurring challenges with learners seeking employment through our programming. Additionally, I reached out to people in the community. I had interviews with our community partners. She's not here, but I want to give a big shout out to Lin from the Welcoming Center. She was awesome. She gave me a lot of help. I also was sending emails to people whose materials I found online with limited feedback. But it was important for me to reach out and try to connect with anybody who'd done this work before. So that was my needs assessment phase. Then I was able to move into developing my curriculum. So after lots of deliberation with case managers and job developers on the employment team, I determined 3 main course objectives, which was 1, that students will be able to participate effectively in job interviews in English. This was the by far #1 concern of the employment staff, because they often attend interviews with the clients and they felt that this is where there had been a really significant language barrier. The second objective was that students will be able to successfully utilize employment-related websites, written communication, forms, and documents in English. And the third was that students will be able to communicate effectively in diverse workplace scenarios with both native and non-native English speakers. Each of these three objectives contained 4 sub-objectives that I created that highlighted more specificity, and then we explored through the course content. Now, the obvious weakness of this is that this was not created with a lot of or any real student input, and instead highlighted the needs that were perceived through the eyes of the staff. While the employment team at Highest certainly has a firm grasp on a lot of what their clients are struggling with in the job process, no one is without their blind spots, and only learners can really tell you their largest obstacles. But consulting with the learners in advance wasn't really an option available to me, and I'm going to speak more at the end about how I'm hoping to incorporate their feedback going into the next semester of this course. When I began this curriculum design process, I had a grand plan. And my grand plan was that I was going to have my entire scope and sequence completed by the time the students showed up on day 1. This was motivated by a few things. The first was by my desire to do well in my work and by my desire to do right by my students. And the second was definitely my anxiety about the lack of control that I would have should this not be the case, and should I not feel ready on day 1. There was a third complication, which was that I was very nervous because I had a student teacher coming in to support me who had signed up to be in our previous program and was now in this program. And I was worried that I wouldn't have sufficient materials to give him, and that he wouldn't have the guidance that he needed. And if we're being totally honest, which is kind of the only way I know how to be, I was also really nervous because when this began, as I said, I was still teaching my old courses, and I was also covering the program coordination for the whole program because my supervisor, who I love very dearly, had just left for maternity leave. So I was kind of doing 3 jobs at once. I was doing my old job, my new job, and my supervisor's job. So I was not done with my scope and sequence by day 1. And what was completed was just kind of like a brief outline that was enough to share a syllabus with students that outlined the different topics and the grammar points we were going to go through on certain weeks. I didn't have my day-by-day objectives like I hoped, but I was able to build the plane as I flew it week by week and adapt accordingly. And like Val said, I didn't want to be strapped in too much anyway, because things are going to change inevitably. I wanted a plan that I could change, but instead I made the plan as I went along. And that actually worked out pretty well in the end, but I was very apprehensive at the beginning. So let's talk about lesson planning. A common refrain is that it takes about 2 to 4 hours of preparation to plan 1 hour of class. And for this first term, I was lucky, again, thanks to Michelle in particular, that rather than a 14-week course, which was what was proposed, we were able to give me a little time and truncate the semester and have it be 10 weeks of teaching. And 10 weeks of teaching with what was asked of me, which was 4 days a week with 3 hours a day. So 9:30 a.m. to 12:30 p.m., Monday through Thursday. That meant that I had to plan approximately 120 hours of class, which means that the most sparing estimate of planning hours is 240 hours of prep, which is about 34 full 7-hour workdays. And the most generous estimate of planning hours for me was about 480 hours, or about 68 full 7-hour workdays. I did have the student teacher, luckily, who could take some halves of certain classes, but even then I was guiding him on what he was going to be teaching about with objectives and content. So the task was daunting, to say the least, and I had to find ways to cope on a highly accelerated timeline. And I think that I did. Something that you guys brought up in the beginning was that you would look and see what else is out there. And I'm so grateful that a wealth of ESL resources exist that are related to employment topics. I pulled out pretty much every stop I could imagine, not only by contacting colleagues at the Welcoming Center, but also by spending hours researching curriculum and lessons that already existed. I'm going to shout out a few of them. If you ever want to review them, you can definitely email me. I have a lot of them saved. But the Neighborhood House's Integrated English and Customer Service Training Curriculum, Literacy Minnesota, ELLI, which is formerly ESL Library, the Change Agent magazine, the Massachusetts Workers Education Roundtable, We Speak NYC, the Alberta Workforce Essential Skills Society, and the materials that have been developed at Highest PA. Our employment team already ran some workshops and things for employment clients that helped me with a lot of tangible Philadelphia specific knowledge. And of course, I had my own lessons that I had planned on topics related to employment from the past. Because of this short timeline, I had put in an order for ESL textbooks that focused on employment topics, but the order didn't go through until halfway through the semester. So I had to pretty much rely on things that were free or very cheap on the internet. But as I said, there is a wealth of those, and I'm very lucky for that. When I thought about how to incorporate real world scenarios, there are certainly many resources online to teach employment topics, but our students are always the best resources when it comes to teaching about personal experiences. So one of the ways that I made sure my content was appropriate for students was by employing an adapted version of the language experience approach. This whole language approach is typically applied to beginning literacy learners to help with reading and writing development. But for this course, I was specifically asked to focus on intermediate level learners. And to be quite honest, I had a lot of advanced learners in my class too. So I adapted the approach to apply to them, and I focused on it from the perspective of personal narrative by encouraging my students to frequently construct and share their narratives as they relate to employment, both in this country and abroad. By doing this, I was able to A, use their personal experiences to inform the class content, making it more relevant and interesting to them. B, help them develop their storytelling abilities, which is very important when you're going through the job search and interview process. And C, save myself some time. I didn't have to develop materials when they were developing it themselves, and we used what they said a lot. And I didn't write this down, but I'm remembering it right now. Sometimes they would totally unprompted share tons of things that we could use for class. One day we were looking at a pay stub, which I'll talk a little bit more about, like authentic materials in a bit. And one of my students just sent one of his pay stubs. And I was like, let me take this down and cross out some of the information in here. But then we looked at it as a class. So they were very eager for their own experiences and materials to be the cornerstone of the class. And I'm really grateful for that. I had really wonderful students. So the last thing is that I used AI a lot. I was really lucky, and I know some of you were in this with me. Shout out to Val. I know at least Val was in this training with me. I was very lucky this summer to participate in the World Education Training on how to use generative AI in adult education contexts. And for me, that could not have come at a more opportune moment. I was really reticent at first to employ tools like ChatGPT. But once I saw how they could support my teaching without dictating my approach, I immediately latched on and used it profusely. ChatGPT allowed me to develop content that was specific to my learning context and employed the language objectives that I was hoping to teach. For example, I could ask ChatGPT to develop 10 examples of beginner level English sentences that incorporated adverb clauses of cause and effect that related to topics of workers' rights. And immediately I had 10 examples to work through. And I could pick the 5 best ones and edit them so that they matched the lesson perfectly, rather than having to come up with everything on the spot, which would have taken me a much longer time. I used ChatGPT to develop first drafts of dialogue scripts, discussion questions, game content, assessments, and more. It really did change my life. And I encourage all educators to become familiar with the capabilities, even if you're not comfortable using it yourself, because I think, this is my opinion, that we need to understand what tools are out there and what's being used, because this is changing our field. And it can save you a lot of time and allow you to focus on what's important. And I'm happy to talk more about that if you'd like to speak more about that. And I know Val and I took our notes together, so whatever I'm telling you, Val could also tell you. There are definitely ways to strategically approach these tools and use them effectively. But yeah, I really encourage you to make use of them if you feel comfortable doing so. Okay. I'm talking really fast. Tell me if I need to slow down. With my curriculum framework, I don't know why this is in there again, because I'm going backwards. That's why. Okay. So let's talk about methodology. The first thing is that I had to incorporate technology into my course pretty much throughout the entire thing, always, because my course was originally designed to be 4 days a week, with 1 class on Mondays in person at our agency's office and 3 classes online. And for the first half of the semester, this is how the class went. But then there were some complications involving our office space, and I had to move the class fully online. I'm really lucky. I mean, I think of this in a positive way, that I had to develop a lot of online teaching skills starting in 2020. And I've been teaching online in some capacity ever since that original shift to online learning, pretty much nonstop. And I'm also lucky that I really like teaching online. And I see it really positively because I've seen in every instance that I've taught online how it's really opened up a whole new world of accessibility for adult learners who have lots of obligations outside of class. And I understand that online learning can also be a breeding ground for inaccessibility and inequity. And I think it's really important that we're honest about that and strategize around how to bring everybody together on equal footing. But I do prefer to view it through this optimistic lens because I have seen amazing things. I've seen adult learners really thrive in these settings. Adult learners who I may have never expected to thrive do extraordinarily well. And also because this is the future. This is the future for many, if not most, adult education programs. So I think it's important that we embrace it as much as we can while still offering what we can offer in person. So my class is conducted via Zoom, and my course communications are conducted via WhatsApp. A lot of my online teaching experience before this has actually been with pre-literate adult learners who really struggled to learn online and struggled with technology wholesale. So as a result of that, I've had to develop some best communication practices with students in a virtual context. So the first thing I do is I don't incorporate extra websites or extra tools into my actual class time. Things like Kahoot, for example, people sing the praises of it all the time. I think it's great. And as amazing as some of the functionalities of things like Kahoot are, it doesn't really work for my class because most of my students are using Zoom for the first time, and the majority of them are not using laptops. They're on their phone. They don't have a secondary device that they could join a game on. They are like going back and forth, and that is really disorienting, especially if you don't even really know how to use Zoom yet. They do know how to use WhatsApp almost always, but Zoom is totally new. And so instead of making it even more complicated for them by trying to incorporate these tools that are great for a lot of especially younger students and allow for a lot of creativity, I tried to maximize the functionalities of what we did have available to us, particularly WhatsApp. So WhatsApp was where my students submitted all their work and were able to participate in a secondary way to the Zoom call. So they could put their writing assignments in WhatsApp in the moment. And they could also, if they didn't want to speak up in class, I had some shyer students, they would put their questions in WhatsApp for me, or clarifying questions and moment contributions that they wanted to make. In WhatsApp, I would also send task instructions that are displayed on the screen. So there were multiple modalities of task instruction delivery in that way. And here's an example of what that would look like. If you were at my last talk with PennTESOL East, you heard me go on and on about how I design my content to be accessible. So I'll try to be brief, but in my slides, I use a high contrast background, an accessible large typeface, icons that indicate the type of task we're engaging in, and sometimes a sentence stem or an example. And if I can, if there's space and if it makes sense, a timer, so that students are aware of how much time they have allotted for the assignment and there's no surprises. Something I started doing in this class that I hadn't done before is that I then send the instructions and the discussion questions again in WhatsApp, and I use emojis and I make it bold so that my students are seeing it in multiple places, especially if they're switching over to look at WhatsApp and type something. I want them to be able to see what I'm asking them to do. So as a result of that, my class WhatsApp group is like a learning portfolio for all of my students, where there's photos of their writing or they're typing, they're sending photos of, different stories that they've told. And I can really draw on that if I ever need to provide a more holistic based, assessment of what my students have learned during the course. Whew. Oh my gosh. Next one. So let's talk about authentic materials. I spoke about this a little bit earlier, but I do want to emphasize again that I worked really hard to select authentic materials as often as possible. This meant that I utilized resources like the Change Agent magazine, which has real stories written by real adult education students about real employment experiences they've had in the United States. I also use authentic materials when it comes to examining pay stubs or accident forms or safety signs. So this grounds the coursework in materials and experiences that students will surely encounter outside. And authentic materials to me also extends to authentic task-based learning that resembles situations that they're going to encounter. So for example, I'm really excited that on Monday, we're going to have our culminating task-based assessment for the whole term, where students are going to come in, dressed appropriately, and complete mock job interviews with members of our employment team to demonstrate everything that they've learned. But we also did shorter authentic tasks throughout the term. If only Rachel was here, my colleague who loves games, because I'm about to talk about how I really tried to make a lot of interactive activities for enhanced engagement. So even if students are on their phones and they can't use a tool like Kahoot, engaging activities are still really important. And I wanted my students to get their brain breaks and to have fun. So throughout the course, I employed the use of games to help solidify the content we learned and assess students' ability to apply what we learned. As you can see here, again, I used a high readability format for the games to increase accessibility. And since students are learning on their phones, they can't complete the games individually, but instead I would lead them for the class and then include them in the materials that were sent around after class each day. And I want to show you what that looks like too. So this is the only like external tool I really used. This tool is called Wakelet. It allows you to, I mean, I've had people describe it different ways. It depends how you design it, but it just lets you make web pages where you share content. So I would put the week's homework up, and then each day I put all the material that we went over. This was so I wasn't inundating them with stuff in the groups. And also, if we scroll all the way down, then they could access everything from the whole course. So I had some students join later and they wanted to know what we had done before. So then they had access to everything via these Wakelet pages. And this will be useful for me going back and seeing what I did. It'll be useful for my students if they want to review it. So that was another way that I designed the course to be accounting for high levels of absences, accessible to all my learners, and also then to provide documentation of what I had done that could then be reviewed later by funders, by my colleagues, by anyone who wanted to take a look.
Is that a free tool, Wakelet?
It is completely free. However, I have a legacy account, which means I've had the account for so long that they can't make me pay for it now, but they have changed it. Now there's a limit on how many pages you can make for free. So I don't have a limit because I've been using this for a few years. I think if you make an account now, there's a limit of like 3 or 5 pages. But I mean, what I've found in the past when I've used this like on a semester cycle is it's better for me to just update the ones they already have than to make a new one every semester. So I'm not going to be making like an infinite number of these things. I think I would lose my marbles doing that. So instead, you know, having a limit on that is not so bad. I mean, Padlet is another great tool and they have a limit as well. And I've still in other classes really been able to make good use of it. Thank you for that question. So let's talk about assessment. I mean, we talked about it a little bit with task-based teaching. The main form of assessment in my classes is pretty much always through task-based teaching. I just really resonate with that teaching methodology. And in the case of employment, this actually isn't as hard because there are a lot of obvious tasks that learners have to complete when they're doing a job search or when they're in their job. Of course, it's going to vary, kind of like what Bill brought up, based on what kind of job they have. I was lucky to spend a lot of time talking to our employment staff about the types of tasks that students do encounter. Unfortunately, some of them have advanced degrees and were literally legal counsel to the presidents of their country. Some of them have never had a job in their life. They're all kind of entering the same entry-level work, at least for now, in the short term that I'm meeting with them. In the longer term, oh my gosh, I'm just looking at the clock. In the longer term, maybe they'd be able to do more of the work from their from their past, but most of them are doing like hard labor, entry-level work, customer service jobs. So our culminating task is a job interview, but we also practice filling out accident reports, reading and writing paychecks, having polite disagreements at work, searching for jobs on the internet. And this framework also allows students to leave the time with me and with each other with tangible skills that they can apply to real life contexts. Talking about like standardized language assessments for 1 minute. Historically, the only way that our students were formally assessed and placed into English levels at our organization was through a use of an in-house language assessment that was developed by our staff. And this was possible because our education program used unrestricted internal funds from the nonprofit. So I know some of you who work in grant-funded programs are probably like, ah! And you're not alone. That's actually how I felt when I first started working there, because I kept thinking, well, what's going to happen if we suddenly have to demonstrate measurable deliverables to funders? How can we demonstrate our effectiveness as instructors and our students' growth in a way that a non-educator can appreciate? And I hadn't really had experience working at places where there was no formal standardized assessment required from an adult education program. So when our funding situation changed, I wasn't really surprised that I had to demonstrate measurable skill gain, and that meant implementing a standardized assessment. I opted to use Best Plus because I felt that it was most accessible for our learners at a variety of levels who may have never taken a standardized test before and would kind of be set up to fail by something like the CASAS or the TABE. I also just felt that these were the most relevant language skills I was hearing from the case managers and from the students. They were very concerned with conversation, and so it felt that Best Plus was most relevant. I'm going to be administering my post-test next week, so I don't know. Hopefully there's some measurable skill gain. And then there's also, we don't have to talk a lot about this, but there is a lot of bureaucracy involved with this. I was delayed in doing my pre-tests. It can become very complicated. So, you know, it's not like I'm singing the praises of, of these tests, but I do think it is good. Something like Best Plus is a good way to demonstrate that your students are learning, as opposed to something like the CASAS tests. Okay, I'm wrapping up here. I'm sure many of you have heard of trauma-informed teaching, and that might have a different meaning to you than it does to someone else. But in our context, we think about it a lot. So I try to keep at the front of my mind the way that the brain changes as a result of trauma. And this informs my entire program structure and delivery, because we know that a brain that is constantly under threat gets very used to the fight, flight, freeze response, and that can inhibit learning. And I actually never really ask my students about their pasts, except in things that really directly relate to work. The resettlement process, even taking out whatever's happened to them before, the actual experience of being resettled as a refugee is extremely traumatic. And that is an ongoing experience that my students are encountering while they're in my class. And I know because I hear about it. And then work can also be a traumatic topic. My students have come forward with stories about being military interpreters in conflict zones, experiencing workplace discrimination, being or witnessing very serious injuries at work, and having nowhere to turn. So as an instructor who broaches these topics, I have to be really prepared for all of these conversations. I want to shout out NSC. Their 6-month trauma-informed certificate program was really helpful, and Literacy Minnesota's trauma-informed teaching has been great. I'm very lucky that I'm also on a team at Highest PA that's very dedicated to creating instructional programs through this framework. So I'm in good company. And this means that I have to practice active listening, but also when we think about the course, high levels of repetition, strong routines, and recognition that's built in. This is a much richer topic we don't really have time for today. I also want to talk about culture shock just a little bit, because culture shock informed my course design in a major way. Typically, we speak about culture shock as going through ups and downs, several ups and downs, beginning with a honeymoon phase and then transitioning to initial culture shock, moving into a surface level adjustment, and then encountering ongoing challenges and hopefully eventually experiencing a comfortable level of adaptation or integration. So knowing that there's these multiple levels of ups and downs, where would you anticipate that someone like me would encounter students in that process? It's kind of a hard question, I guess.
I'll take a guess since I see everyone's mute signs still up.
Yeah,
maybe the first down.
Yeah, Usually I'm coming to know them right as they're going into that initial culture shock phase. There are some exceptions to this, students who have been here longer who join my program. But yeah, typically the honeymoon phase is pretty short for refugees because there's such a quick onset of pressure with all their appointments. And so I'm with them as they're experiencing their first low. And I need to think about, when I decide my course, how can I be sensitive to the experiences of culture shock and resettlement? The classroom needs to be welcoming. It needs to be a safe place to land. And even if I'm logically helping them understand the culture, they're going to encounter these things for the first time, and that can be really hard. It's also not for nothing. The experience of work in other countries is very different from here. A lot of countries don't have the Protestant work ethic that is rampant in our culture, and they can struggle to feel confident under the immense pressure to become employed really quickly. And a lot of them are unsatisfied with the jobs that they find here because it's very different than the work that they did in their home country. So as a result, the classroom becomes a highly emotional place. And I have to be able to hold space for all of that and make sure that all my students feel safe. If one student's having an emotional experience, how is that going to affect everyone else? I have to keep that in mind all the time. I'm going to talk really briefly about the changes I've proposed and have been mostly approved moving forward. I am getting feedback from my students next week, and by me, I'm not going to be there. We're going to have the employment staff do it. I'm going to be out of the room. They're going to use interpreters. And so that'll maybe change some of these things, but these are the changes that I've proposed. And the reason I'm proposing these changes is not super related to the curriculum and has a lot more to do with what Val brought up, the administrative complications and the things on the back end. My students had low levels of attendance, but high levels of retention. So students overall really struggled to attend 4 days a week, but they were returning again and again and again, even if it was 1 day a week or 2 days a week, because they had so many other commitments that were preventing them from joining the class. And I explained some of the complications that could bring that on earlier. I mean, I personally cannot imagine how I would handle the logistical nightmare that is resettlement, where you're adapting to a new country, learning a new language, going to all these appointments, processing the trauma of resettlement, and then on top of that, being expected to go to 12 hours of class a week. So, and on top of that, a number of my students got jobs. And then they couldn't come back, which is great. But then they would voice to me that they were really sad that they were missing the rest of the class. So that's why my first proposal is to shorten the term to 6 weeks and have 2 cycles within the semester, so that people are getting employed, but they're still able to join the class. If you join halfway through, it'll cycle through again, and you can get that beginning stuff very shortly thereafter. Also, because my students who joined later were getting more complicated stuff, but they hadn't gotten any foundation. So that's my attempt to mitigate that issue. My second proposal is to change it to 3 days a week and have it be entirely online rather than 1 day in person. And then offering, in addition, 3 in-person workshops that could not be easily changed to an online context, because I think that is also why my in-person sessions were poorly attended, as my students thought it's such a trek from where I live in the deep southeast or deep southwest or the far northeast to get to this office. And you know what you're doing, we could just do online. So this is in addition to class. My dad is calling me. Sorry about that. This is in addition to classes, would be guest speakers, participatory activities, things that are required of the class but are additional to the class. And then I want to open it up to everyone. In turn, like having it just be employment clients keeps the class really small. And even if I can't count those students towards our grant, I think it creates a better learning environment when there's a bigger class. I know everybody talks about small class sizes with kids, but I think with these adults, they want a bigger class size because then they have more opportunities for negotiation of meaning with their peers, more participation and less pressure. I think some of my students felt pressure in a small class to participate a lot, even when they weren't ready. I also think the definition of a job seeker is really stringent and it's not fair. And there are a lot of non-traditional students who aren't job seekers who would still benefit from this class. So I'm hoping that that will go well. Here's my conclusion. Again, I'm being honest because that's just my style. This was very challenging for me. There were days where I was working a lot outside of my hours, on weekends, on nights. I felt the pressure of doing right by my students. I felt the pressure of doing right by my supervisor, who I love so much, who was with her baby. I felt the pressure of working at a place where everybody I knew there held themselves to these incredible standards, and the quality of work is so high. And I wanted to live up to that. And ultimately, I don't think that that made my work better. I think in education and nonprofits and in refugee work, we have these unhealthy expectations of ourselves, or at least I see that and I experience that. We struggle to balance our work and our life because we implicitly tie our self-work into our ability to give back. And at least speaking for myself, I feel that when I'm not able to do that, that I have failed and that I'm not as good of a person as I want to be. And that's not fair. And I would really, really hate if you left this presentation with that norm of overproductivity and self-sacrifice reinforced. I'm really proud of what I did. I think I've done a good job, but I would not do this again. None of us are paid enough, and it makes your work worse. So that's not what I'm about. It's not what my students want. It's not what my colleagues want. Pretty sure it's not what you want for yourself. So it's important to hold ourselves to high standards. But I think the highest standard we should hold ourselves to is taking care of ourselves. You got to look out for number one, and that's all we've got. I took a lot longer to do this than I thought. So this last breakout room question, how are you going to use this to inform your work going forward? I think I'm going to let you just reflect on that yourself, because we don't really have the time, and I want to leave time for questions. Thank you all so much for listening. I know I talk really fast, a mile a minute. I hope this was useful for you. I appreciate you being here. And if you want to email me, I'll put my email in the chat. I'm happy to talk about any of this more. Thank you so much for listening. And yeah, I'm open to any questions that you have about this.
This was amazing. Thank you so much.